A journey through British history, from ancient beginnings to modern Britain. Introduction. Hello everyone, and welcome to another exciting journey through time. Today, we're exploring the rich tapestry of British history, a tale spanning thousands of years, from ancient stone circles to the global power that shaped the modern world. Britain's story is one of invasion and settlement, revolution and evolution, empire and industry. So let's dive into this fascinating journey through the ages of this remarkable island nation. Prehistoric Britain. Our story begins long before written records, in a time when Britain was still physically connected to continental Europe. Around 8500 BCE, rising sea levels created the English Channel, turning Britain into an island. The earliest evidence of human habitation in Britain dates back nearly 900,000 years, but it was during the Neolithic period, starting around 4000 BCE, that we see the first significant permanent settlements. These early Britons were farmers who cleared forests and built remarkable monuments that still captivate us today. Stonehenge, arguably Britain's most famous prehistoric monument, was constructed in stages between 3000 and 1500 BCE. These massive stones, some weighing up to 25 tons, were transported over considerable distances, a feat that demonstrates the organizational capabilities and determination of these early inhabitants. But Stonehenge isn't alone. Avebury, Silbury Hill, and countless other stone circles and burial mounds dot the landscape, silent witnesses to Britain's ancient past. Roman Britain. Britain's recorded history begins with the Romans. Julius Caesar led expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, but it wasn't until 43 CE, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, that Rome launched a full-scale invasion. The Romans called this new province Britannia, and their influence was profound. They established cities like Londinium, London, Aquae Sulis, Bath, and Eboracum, York. They built straight roads that connected military forts and colonial settlements, many of which still form the basis of Britain's road network today. Perhaps the most visible legacy of Roman Britain is Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile defensive fortification constructed around 122 CE across northern England. It marked the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire and served as a symbol of Roman power. Roman Britain wasn't without resistance. Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe led a famous rebellion in 60-61 CE, temporarily capturing and burning Londinium before being defeated. Despite such uprisings, Roman rule brought unprecedented urbanization, trade, and cultural exchange to Britain. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire was crumbling. Around 410 CE, with Rome itself under threat, the last Roman legions withdrew from Britain, ending nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule and opening the door to a new chapter in British history. Anglo-Saxon Britain. As Roman power faded, Britain faced invasions from Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, from across the North Sea. These migrations weren't a single event but occurred over generations, gradually transforming the cultural and political landscape of Britain. By the 7th century, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had emerged across what is now England, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. This period is often called the Heptarchy, referring to these 7 kingdoms. Meanwhile, the Celtic peoples were pushed to the western and northern fringes, Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. Christianity, which had first arrived during Roman times, returned to Britain with St. Augustine's mission to Kent in 597 CE. Monasteries became centers of learning, producing magnificent works like the Lindisfarne Gospels. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun during Alfred the Great's reign, provides us with valuable insights into this period. Speaking of Alfred the Great, who ruled Wessex from 871 to 899 CE, he successfully defended his kingdom against Viking invasions and laid the foundations for a unified England. His descendants would eventually bring all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under their rule. Viking Age. The late 8th century saw the beginning of Viking raids on Britain. In 793 CE, Norse warriors attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, a shocking event that heralded centuries of Viking activity in Britain. By the mid-9th century, Vikings were no longer just raiders but settlers. They conquered and settled in northern and eastern England, establishing an area known as the Danelaw. York became a Viking city, renamed Jorvik. Alfred the Great's resistance to the Vikings in Wessex prevented complete Viking domination. His successors reconquered the Danelaw during the 10th century, but Viking influence remained strong in many areas. In 1016, after renewed Viking invasions, Cnut the Great became king of all England, incorporating it into his North Sea Empire that included Denmark and Norway. Following Cnut's death, the Anglo-Saxon line was briefly restored under Edward the Confessor, but the stage was set for the most famous date in English history, 1066. Norman conquest and medieval England. The year 1066 marks a watershed in British history. When Edward the Confessor died childless, three men claimed the English throne: Harold Godwinson, who was crowned King Harold II, Harold Hardrada of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy. Harold defeated the Norwegian king at Stamford Bridge in September 1066, but just 3 weeks later, exhausted from marching his army south, he faced William's Norman forces at the Battle of Hastings. Harold was killed, reportedly, by an arrow to the eye, and William became king, forever after known as William the Conqueror. The Norman conquest brought profound changes to England. A new Norman aristocracy replaced the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Castles were built across the land to control the population. The Domesday Book, commissioned in 1086, was a comprehensive survey of England's lands and resources, essentially a record of who owned what, allowing William to efficiently tax his new kingdom. Norman rule also connected England more closely with continental European politics and culture. French became the language of the court and ruling class, while Latin remained the language of the church and scholarship. Old English evolved into Middle English, absorbing thousands of French words. The medieval period saw the rise of powerful monarchs like Henry II, who established the foundations of English common law, and the infamous King John, whose overreach led to the Magna Carta in 1215, a charter limiting royal power that became a cornerstone of constitutional governance. The Plantagenet dynasty ruled England from 1154 to 1485, overseeing periods of territorial expansion, particularly in France, and devastating conflicts like the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453. This long struggle for control of French territories ultimately ended with England losing nearly all its continental possessions except Calais. The Wars of the Roses and Tudor England. The 15th century brought internal conflict to England. The Wars of the Roses, 1455-1487, were a series of civil wars between the houses of Lancaster and York, both branches of the Plantagenet dynasty. The conflict ended when Henry Tudor, of Lancastrian descent, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, establishing the Tudor dynasty. The Tudor period, spanning 1485 to 1603, was one of the most transformative in English history. Henry VII restored stability after decades of civil war. His son, Henry VIII, is perhaps most famous for his 6 marriages and his break with the Roman Catholic Church. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry established the Church of England with himself as supreme head. This English Reformation continued under Henry's children. His son, Edward Dicas, pushed for more Protestant reforms, while Mary I attempted to restore Catholicism, earning the nickname Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants. Finally, Elizabeth I established a moderate Protestant church settlement that allowed for relative religious stability. Elizabeth's reign, 1558-1603, often called the Elizabethan Age, was a period of cultural flowering, with figures like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe creating works that still resonate today. It was also a time of exploration and early colonial ventures, with men like Francis Drake circumnavigating the globe and the first, ultimately unsuccessful, English colony established at Roanoke. Elizabeth never married, and with her death in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended. The crown passed to her cousin's son, James VI of Scotland, who became James the Fawn of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. The Stuart era and Civil War. The Stuart dynasty brought its own challenges. James I believed in the divine right of kings, a position that put him at odds with Parliament. These tensions escalated under his son, Charles the Fir, leading to the English Civil War, 1642-1651. This war between parliamentarians, or Roundheads, and royalists, or Cavaliers, resulted in the defeat and execution of Charles III in 1649, the first and only time a reigning English monarch was publicly tried and executed. England briefly became a republic known as the Commonwealth, led by Oliver Cromwell. After Cromwell's death, the monarchy was restored in 1660 with Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch for his hedonistic court. However, religious tensions persisted. When James II, a Catholic, came to the throne in 1685, fears of Catholic absolutism led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where James was deposed in favor of his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. The Bill of Rights in 1689 established the supremacy of Parliament over the monarch, paving the way for the constitutional monarchy that still exists today. The Act of Union in 1707 officially united England and Scotland to create Great Britain, consolidating the Union of Crowns that had existed since 1603. Georgian Britain and the Industrial Revolution. The 18th century saw Britain emerge as a global power. Under the Hanoverian kings, George I, II, and III, Britain built a vast empire through naval dominance, commercial expansion, and colonial settlement. The 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, established British hegemony in North America and India, although the American colonies would soon rebel, gaining independence in 1783. Perhaps even more significant than imperial expansion was the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain around 1760. This transformation from an agrarian to an industrial society was driven by technological innovations like James Watt's improved steam engine, which powered factories, mines, and eventually railways and steamships. Cities grew rapidly as people moved from rural areas to work in factories. Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and other industrial centers expanded dramatically, often with poor living conditions for workers. New social classes emerged: industrial capitalists and an urban working class. Britain's political landscape also evolved during this period. The influence of the monarchy declined, while that of Parliament increased. However, the franchise remained limited to property-owning men, and corruption was rampant in the electoral system. Victorian Britain and the height of empire. Queen Victoria's reign, 1837 to 1901, the longest of any British monarch until recently surpassed by Elizabeth II, saw Britain reach the apex of its global power. The British Empire expanded to cover approximately 1/4 of the Earth's land surface, leading to the saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. This was an age of confidence and contradiction. Britain led the world in industry, trade, banking, and naval power. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the Crystal Palace, showcased Britain's industrial and imperial might. Yet Victorian society was also marked by stark inequality, with extreme poverty existing alongside great wealth. Social reform movements gained strength during this period. The franchise was gradually extended through Reform Acts in 1832, 1867, and 1884. Labor movements organized to improve working conditions. The women's suffrage movement began campaigning for women's right to vote. Culturally, Victorian Britain produced literary giants like Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, and Alfred Lord Tennyson. It was also a period of significant scientific advancement, most notably Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. By the late Victorian era, Britain faced increasing competition from other industrial powers, particularly Germany and the United States. The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, revealed military weaknesses and triggered debates about imperial overextension. As the 20th century dawned, Britain remained powerful but faced mounting challenges to its global dominance. World Wars and the decline of empire. The 20th century brought unprecedented challenges to Britain. World War I, 1914 to 1918, resulted in enormous casualties and strained Britain's economy. The conflict accelerated social change, including women's suffrage, partially granted in 1918 and fully in 1928, and the decline of the aristocracy. The interwar period saw economic struggles, including the Great Depression and the rise of the Labour Party as a major political force. Britain's global position remained strong, but the empire began showing signs of strain as nationalist movements grew in various colonies. World War II, 1939-1945, further tested British resolve. Under Winston Churchill's leadership, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany for a year after the fall of France until the Soviet Union and United States entered the war. The Blitz, German bombing of British cities, became a symbol of civilian endurance. Victory came at a high cost. Britain emerged from the war financially exhausted and heavily indebted to the United States. The Labour government elected in 1945 established the National Health Service and other elements of the welfare state, but also presided over the beginning of imperial dissolution, with India gaining independence in 1947. The Suez Crisis of 1956, where British intervention in Egypt was abandoned under American pressure, symbolized Britain's diminished status. Over the following decades, most British colonies gained independence, with Hong Kong's return to China in 1997 marking the effective end of the British Empire. Modern Britain. Post-imperial Britain had to redefine its role in the world. It developed a special relationship with the United States and joined the European Economic Community, later the European Union, in 1973, though this relationship ended with Brexit in 2020. Domestically, Britain experienced significant social and economic changes. The 1960s brought cultural revolution. The 1970s saw economic crises and industrial unrest. Margaret Thatcher's premiership, 1979-1990, transformed the economy through privatization, deregulation, and confrontation with trade unions. Tony Blair's New Labour government, 1997-2007, continued many Thatcherite economic policies while investing more in public services. The 2008 financial crisis led to austerity policies under Conservative-led governments from 2010 onwards. Devolution has changed Britain's constitutional arrangement, with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland gaining varying degrees of self-government. The 2014 Scottish independence referendum resulted in Scotland remaining in the UK, but the question remains alive. Meanwhile, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought peace to Northern Ireland after decades of conflict. Britain today is a multicultural society. Post-war immigration, particularly from former colonies, has diversified the population. London is one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities. While Britain's global influence has diminished since its imperial height, it remains significant in international affairs, culture, finance, and education. Conclusion. From ancient stone circles to Brexit, Britain's history reflects constant change and adaptation. Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, and Normans all left their mark on what would become one of history's most influential nations. Britain's gift for reinvention has allowed it to survive the loss of empire and forge a new identity in the modern world. As we've seen throughout this journey, British history is a complex interplay of monarchy and democracy, imperialism and multiculturalism, tradition and innovation. Understanding this rich historical tapestry helps us better comprehend not just Britain itself, but the many nations and societies worldwide that have been shaped by British influence. Thank you for joining me on this historical journey through British history. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating stories of our world's past.